Well guys, looks like we made it to the Villisca Axe Murder House. Let's take a look. Today, we're going over the Villisca Axe Murders. Not only one of the most well-known unsolved cases in Iowa history, but one of the most well-known cases of paranormal activity in the entire country. And when people hear the tragic story of what happened to the Moore family, they travel far and wide to get a glimpse at the area where the tragic murders took place, in hopes to experience a paranormal event of their own. So, with that being said, let's get into it. Shortly after midnight on June 10th, 1912, a stranger wielding an axe lifted the latch on the back of the two-story house owned by the Moore family in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. Now, being a small town in the middle of Iowa, it was not uncommon for people not to lock their doors. The entire population at the time was around 2,000 people, and again, people believed that it was a safe area, and leaving your doors unlocked was not unheard of. Unfortunately, this belief that they were safe turned out to be a big mistake. The stranger quietly entered the house and made his way up the narrow staircase to the second floor, where Josiah Moore, age 43, and his wife Sarah Moore, age 39, slept quietly. He snuck around to the side of the bed, lifted the axe he was wielding over his left shoulder, and brought the blunt end of the axe down onto the back of Josiah Moore's head. And as soon as he did this, he lifted the axe up as quickly as he could, causing the axe to get momentarily stuck in the wall behind him. He pulled the axe out, turned it around to the sharp end, and then brought it down on top of Sarah Moore, who was sleeping next to her recently deceased husband. This is the room where the parents were sleeping whenever they were attacked. Kind of the crazy thing is, I don't know how well you can see it. Up here is believed where the upswing of the axe happened. He brought it down on top of them. So then the axe got stuck in the roof or the wall. I pulled it out and continued to hit him. Focus. Oh man. Okay, my camera's on autofocus and it's focusing on something next to me. See? That's weird. After the killer was confidently satisfied that both Josiah and Sarah Moore were dead, he crept into the adjoining room where the Moore children slept, and one by one he would continue his process with 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Mary, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. One by one, he would murder each of them with the blunt side of the axe. Okay, so this is the room where the Moore children were sleeping. There's a bed, another bed, and then the crib. And the crazy thing is, this room here is literally right next to the parents' room. And how everybody was sleeping that night, didn't hear anybody come in. It's pretty interesting. This alone would have been a tragedy. But only hours before this, the Moore family attended a children's program at their local church and were accompanied home by two friends of the Moore family. And they were allowed to actually spend the night at the Moore house. So as the Moore family was being bludgeoned to death upstairs, 8-year-old Ina and 12-year-old Lena Stillinger slept quietly in the downstairs bedroom. The killer did make his way downstairs to the guest bedroom, where he found the Stillinger girls sleeping, and he would continue his murderous rampage with 8-year-old Ina. Now, doing this, evidence shows that it is possible that he woke up the older sister, Lena, as she was the only one who had any kind of defensive wounds on her body. It looked like she had used her arm to try and block the axe from coming down. However, she would fail in this attempt. Okay, so this is the room where the Stillinger girls were slain that night. And this is the bedroom, the area, all pretty much made to look exactly how it was that night. Whenever he snuck in here. It's believed that after he was finished with the Stillinger girls, the killer would make his way back upstairs and continue to bludgeon the head of Josiah Moore. It was estimated that he was hit around another 30 times, as his head was completely unrecognizable and in pieces. And this is where things take an even stranger turn, as after the killer was done taking his time with his victims, he would go from room to room, covering every mirror with a piece of cloth. He then went and covered the heads of all of his victims with a piece of cloth, and made sure to close all of the curtains. And this covering the mirrors and all the reflective surfaces with cloth left one of the biggest questions as to why did he do this. And I believe I have a theory on why he did this, but I will get into that in a little bit whenever we go over the suspects. After washing his hands in a bowl of water that was left at the scene, the killer then wrapped a 2-pound slab of bacon in a towel and left it in the Stillinger room. And why did he do this? It's a good question, but it's honestly just one of the strange things that goes along with this case. No one really knows why he did this. Now, it's believed that the killer hung around for a few more hours, leaving at around 2 a.m. that morning, locking the doors and taking the key with him. The next morning at around 5 a.m., a neighbor lady named Mary Peckham was hanging laundry when she noticed how unusually quiet the Moore house was, and she thought it was strange that no one was out doing the daily chores. A few hours later, whenever the horses in the Moore stable started making noise, she went to the house to check on the Moore family, but found the doors to be locked. At this point, Mary knew that something had to be wrong, so she got a hold of Josiah Moore's brother, Ross, who had a key to the Moore family home. Whenever Ross arrived, he unlocked the door, went inside, but only a few minutes later to come running out of the house, shocked at what he had just discovered. He then got a hold of the Villisca Marshal, Hank Horton, and honestly after this, it set into motion a series of events that would pretty much destroy any chance of collecting evidence to help solve this crime. Horton brought along Drs. J. Clark Cooper, Edgar Hugh, and Wesley Ewing, who was the minister of the Moores Presbyterian Church. They were followed by the county coroner, L.A. Lindquist, and a third doctor, F.S. Williams, who became the first to examine the bodies and to estimate the time of death. When a shaken Dr. Williams emerged from the house, he cautioned the growing crowd outside, "Don't go in there, boys. You'll regret it till the last day of your life." Many ignored this advice, with over 100 people estimated to have trampled the crime scene, wiping away fingerprints, leaving fingerprints, and in one case, somebody actually took part of the skull of Josiah Moore as a keepsake. Truly an unprofessional way to handle the crime scene, but before I get into the suspects, I kind of want to go into the paranormal side of this case. It's no wonder, with such a tragic event happening in the small town, that not long after the murders, rumors had gone around of the house being haunted. Reports of disembodied voices and footsteps were reported, along with reports of objects moving on their own. But to me, one of the most compelling stories of paranormal activity in the house happened on November 7th, 2014, to a man named Robert Larson, age 37, who, with his elderly parents, were doing an overnight investigation, whenever Larson, by himself, in the attic area of the house, which was believed to be the area the killer might have been hiding in, waiting for the family to go to sleep that night. At around 12:45, while he was doing his investigation and calling for the spirits to show themselves, Robert Larson picked up his own knife and stabbed himself in the chest. He was discovered in a pool of his own blood and quickly rushed to the hospital, where luckily he survived. But he never really explained what compelled him to stab himself in the first place. The caretaker, a man named Johnny Hauser, who had his own paranormal experiences with the house, mentioned on a podcast that after the stabbing, it kind of changed the way he felt about the house. He stopped doing overnight investigations and started to avoid being in the house alone. Okay, so this is kind of creepy, but I'm going to show you this area. This is the doorway into the attic. Very creepy. They believe that this is where the killer might have been hiding that night while the family was sleeping, waiting for them all to go to sleep so that he could make his move. pretty crazy. So yeah. So this is the area where they believe he was hiding. Possibly hiding. Unless he was to break in the house, but it's a good possibility that he wasn't here the entire time. Okay, if there's anybody in here, if you could touch my flashlight there, it should be able to turn on. So if there's anybody up here, if you could touch my flashlight, it should turn on. Okay, that's awesome. Can you touch it again, turn it off? Touch it again. Oh my god. As you can see, no one around it and the light has turned on. Turn off. I got the spirit box. I'm in the room where the Moran parents died, and we're going to see if we can get any responses. Alright. Is there anybody in this room? You should be able to communicate with us through the spirit box. What's your name? Okay. Can you say your name? I'm walking into the children's room. Can you say what your name is? I heard Boyd. Is there anybody else in here? Could this voice that came through the spirit box in the children's bedroom be the voice of Boyd Moore, the 7-year-old who was bludgeoned to death in this room? So is the Villisca Axe Murder House actually haunted? I don't know. I think I found some pretty interesting evidence, but I guess I'll let you guys decide. But I'm glad I came here. This is one of the biggest ones I've ever done, and I'm glad you guys came with me on this one, so thank you. See you in the next one. Now, let's look at some of the suspects. First, we have a man named Frank Jones. Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones for a number of years at his implement store, until Josiah decided to open his own implement store in 1908. Now, according to the residents of Villisca, this very much upset Frank Jones. But it was also mentioned that Frank believed that Josiah was having an affair with his daughter-in-law. Detective Wilkerson openly accused Frank Jones and his son of hiring a hitman named William Blackie Mansfield to kill Josiah Moore. Both Frank Jones and his son both denied any involvement in the murders, and both were never arrested. However, the potential hitman, Blackie Mansfield, was arrested in 1916. Detective Wilkerson believed that he was responsible for the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law on July 5, 1914 in Blue Island, Illinois, a full 2 years after the Villisca Axe murders. Furthermore, he believed that Mansfield was responsible for the axe murder that happened in Pola, Kansas just 4 days before the Villisca Axe massacre. He also pinned another axe murder that happened in Aurora, Colorado on Mansfield as well. Now, as I mentioned, Mansfield was arrested, but he was able to provide receipts from his pay stubs that showed that he was in Illinois during the time of both the Villisca Axe murders and the Pola, Kansas murders, and due to lack of evidence, Mansfield was released. Now we look at the Reverend George Kelly. Reverend George Kelly was a traveling preacher originally born in England, and he and his wife settled into Iowa after traveling around the Midwest for a number of years. In my personal opinion, Reverend George Kelly is the man that more than likely is responsible for these murders. He attended that children's program that night and left early the next morning by train before the bodies were discovered, but it was mentioned by a couple of passengers on the train that Reverend George Kelly mentioned to them that 8 poor souls lost their lives in Villisca last night. and this, like I said, was before the bodies were even discovered. Later, the passengers on the train that said they spoke with Kelly would go back on their report. However, it did not help his case any that he would write lengthy letters to the investigators and also pose as an investigator from Scotland Yard to get an inside look at the house not long after the murders. And it's a well-known fact that a lot of serial killers and murderers in general like to go back to the area where the crimes happened, almost to like relive them. So this whole thing seemed very suspicious to me. He also sent a bloody shirt to the drugstore to get cleaned the next week. And if you look further into his history, you'll see that Reverend George Kelly was diagnosed as a schizophrenic person. He was eventually arrested 5 years later and would confess to the murders. He said that night on June 9th, he heard the sound of windmills and decided to go for a walk to clear his head. He pondered the sermon about killing utterly whenever he found himself outside of the Moore home. He said in a trance-like state, he picked up an axe, went inside, and began killing. He claimed that first he killed the adults. He heard a voice telling him to keep going, so then he went and bludgeoned the Moore children, and then he found himself downstairs, and he heard the voice of God said, again, so then he finished with the Stillinger girls. And not a big surprise that later on, Reverend George Kelly would recant his confession, saying that it was coerced out of him by the police. As I mentioned before, the killer was left-handed. To get more evidence on Reverend George Kelly, they asked him to chop some wood, which he did using primarily his left hand. But even with this massive pile of evidence against Kelly, due to him recanting his confession, and the couple that spoke to him the following day after the murders on that train, changing their story, the grand jury on Kelly's case found themselves 11-1 in favor of not indicting him, and the second panel freed him completely. I mentioned that I wanted to look into why the killer had covered the mirrors in the home, as it left a question of why would he do this, and I looked into it. And many religions believe that covering the mirrors in the house of where somebody died makes it easier for the spirit of that person or persons not to get trapped in the house and actually move on to the other side. In my opinion, this would also point to the Reverend George Kelly, as he mentioned that God was the one who told him to do these killings in the first place. Now, God wouldn't want their souls to be trapped in the house, but rather to move on to the other side. So covering the mirrors in the house would ultimately ensure that they did. Now, this of course is all just speculation, and the truth is that somebody committed a terrible crime and got away with it, as no one was ever actually convicted for these murders, and the house that it happened in went on to be a hotspot for strange occurrences. Will we ever get a definitive answer as to who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger girls that night in Villisca, Iowa? The truth is, probably not, and the case will remain unsolved. But, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the like, subscribe, all the good stuff you know, and I will see you in the next one.